In the last days of 1973, Deborah Curbs was a 17-year-old student at Fresno High School. Her friends and teachers described her as a cheerful and outstanding student. On December 31, 1973, Deborah hosted a small get-together inside her family's residence located on the 4000 block of College Avenue in Fresno, California, while her parents were away in Pismo. To welcome the new year, Deborah Curbs and her friends, which included her boyfriend and another couple, engaged in puzzle solving while listening to music. When the clock struck midnight, signaling the start of the year 1974, the small party ended and the young host bid her friends farewell. Tragically, Deborah would only have a little glimpse of a potentially fruitful year. On January 1, 1974, in the late afternoon, Deborah's parents came back home to find her lying dead with her own leotard wrapped around her neck. When the tragedy was reported to the police, an investigation into the case was launched, and detectives started looking into persons who had last seen Deborah alive, specifically those who had attended her party hours earlier. A young man named James Arthur Blaylock, who was 17 years old at the time, was quickly suspected by authorities. James was one of the party attendants and had come along with his girlfriend to the gathering. He was said to have driven the others home when they left Deborah's residence. Authorities believed that James Blaylock might have committed the murder. They were of the opinion that he had gone back to the Curbs family home, using a spare key he had known the location of to get inside and rape and kill Deborah. Unfortunately, though, that was only a theory. There was no concrete proof to convict James for the crime. In 1974, due to a lack of supporting forensic equipment, detectives were unable to prove what they so firmly felt to be true: the fact that 17-year-old James Blaylock was a deadly killer. The Deborah Curbs case, however, slowly became cold. Many years later, in 2006, the Fresno County Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation and attempted to run some of the biological evidence collected from the crime scene through recently developed DNA technology. This time, there was a success. James Blaylock's DNA matched the sexual assault kit. To further confirm this, Deborah Curbs' body was also exhumed in 2006, so that a DNA sample from her could be obtained. The samples were then submitted to the Serological Research Institute, a non-profit forensic lab in California that soon confirmed James Blaylock as the culprit investigators have been looking for all these years. James Blaylock, who was incarcerated at the time, was subsequently interviewed by Fresno County Sheriff's detectives Marty Rivera and Jeff Kurtzen. He denied killing Deborah and having sex with her. Blaylock soon changed his account after the detectives confronted him with a DNA match of his semen. He claimed he and Deborah had consensual sex but never killed her. The case was brought by the district attorney's office, but it had to be dropped for lack of supporting evidence. The case went cold again for another 15 years. In December 2021, Sergio Toscano, a current cold case detective and former Fresno County Sheriff's officer, revisited the Deborah Curbs case and asked for a repeat DNA test on the leotard used to strangle Deborah. James Blaylock's DNA results were obtained again. His DNA was confirmed on the sexual assault kit and also appeared on the leotard. After this discovery, in 2023 detectives tried to get in touch with James Blaylock, but they soon learned that he had died in the hospital in 2022. He was 66 years old at the time. Blaylock had a significant criminal history over the course of his lifetime, which included violent crimes and becoming a registered sex offender. Hikers on the Pacific Crest Trail made a grisly discovery at the Los Coyotes Indian Reservation on February 16, 1986. At the edge of the campsite, a woman's body, which was partially decomposed, was found. The San Diego County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene right away and got to work on the investigation. While at it, the San Diego County Sheriff's Office soon got a call that would completely change the situation. A man in a comparable state was discovered 14 miles away from the female victim. Both murder victims were covered up in layers of clothing and heavy jackets. Because of the striking similarities between them, investigators knew they had to identify both bodies before their killer could be found. In both of these cases, law enforcement has withheld a great deal of information. To maintain the integrity of the investigation, the cause of death of the man who was discovered 14 miles away was never disclosed. Detectives had a hard time moving either of the cases forward. There was a dearth of evidence, and what little evidence the San Diego County Sheriff's Office did possess was kept from the media. Before interest waned, the Jane Doe's murder was briefly covered by the media. Although the San Diego County Sheriff's Office was aware that there was a family out there looking for their loved one, the female victim's case would go unsolved for decades, until in 2023, when the San Diego County Sheriff's Office began using genetic genealogy. The Jane Doe's hair was sent in for testing on websites like 23andMe and GEDmatch. Detectives were able to create family trees and locate relatives using this DNA analysis, census data, and other public information. After identifying the victim's family tree, all that remained for the investigators to do was to locate the missing link. Following the submission of her DNA, law enforcement quickly identified the Jane Doe as Claudette Jean Zabolski Powers. Claudette Jean would have been 24 years old when she was savagely murdered. Her life before her disappearance in the early 1980s was pieced together by detectives. She had been married with 2 kids. She and her husband relocated from their home in Michigan to Washington. By 1983, Claudette had filed for a divorce and had found a house in San Diego County for her and her 2 daughters. However, the death of her father in 1984 brought tragedy to the Powers family. Claudette didn't take her father's death so well. She loved her father so much that when he died, she felt lost. According to family members, Claudette was last seen or spoken to at her father's funeral in September 1984. She completely vanished from the surface of the earth. Her family claimed that they never stopped trying to find her. When it seemed difficult to locate her, her siblings hired a private investigator to help search for her. Still, it yielded nothing. They then only hoped that one day she would come back home. She was never formally reported missing, and her family was unaware that she had passed away for all these years. Despite the fact that she has now been identified, the investigation is far from over. Authorities must now reconstruct Claudette's life from September 1984 to September 1986. According to some reports, Claudette may have worked as a waitress in Escondido, so anyone with information or who may have known her is urged to come forward. It has been extremely difficult for her family. Her sister, Laura Fries, told the media in a statement, "If you know of my sister, you have worked with her, you have seen her. It would have been back in 84, early 80s to 85 when she come up missing. Please contact the San Diego Sheriff's Department to tell them what you know about her. Somebody knows what happened." The investigation is still ongoing, and neither the Jane Doe nor Claudette's cause of death have been disclosed by the San Diego County Sheriff's Office. They have stated that Claudette died violently and that they are searching for a male suspect. Additionally, they want to find out who killed the man. They claimed that the man was about Claudette's age, in his mid-20s, and that they were both wearing thermals and other camping-appropriate attire. They had both passed away for about 2 weeks before their bodies were discovered. No other personal items or bags or purses containing camping supplies were discovered. They would have needed a vehicle to travel to the crime scene because it was far away. There are currently no Jane Doe sketches or other details that could be used to identify him. After Claudette Jean Zabolski Powers' DNA matched with Laura Fries, her youngest sister, who has been worried about her for years, Laura remembered her sister in an interview saying, "Claudette was a very devoted and thoughtful mother. She adored her children dearly. She cherished her family dearly." She further added that their mother can pass away peacefully when the time comes, knowing that her oldest child has been located. Right now, there is a $1,000 reward for any information that results in an arrest of Claudette's killer. So anyone with information is urged to call the Sheriff's Homicide Unit at 858-285-6330.
In June 1980, Holly Ann Campilia, a native of New Jersey, vanished following a period of poor mental health. Holly had been battling with mental issues since high school, but she became increasingly erratic when she got to college. One fateful day, on her way to a counseling appointment, she jumped out of her mother's car and was never seen again. All her family knew at the time was that she hitchhiked to Sacramento. After sending her family one letter, Holly stopped contacting them. Immediately after her disappearance, her parents, Augustine and Sally Campilia, reported her missing. But unknowingly to them, her name was accidentally removed from the National Missing Persons Database. Meanwhile, in August 1980, The body of a 21-year-old woman was discovered in a cornfield off Seavers Road in Dixon, not far from the location of the current Pedrick produce market. She was dressed in a green wool sweater despite the summer heat and had been shot in the head numerous times. Detectives at the time had no idea that the woman's name had unintentionally been erased from the National Missing People database just 2 weeks prior. The victim and her murderer could not be identified, and so she was dubbed Dixon Jane Doe for 12 years. In 1992, when Augustine and Sally Campilia got to know that their daughter, Holly Ann Campilia, had accidentally dropped from the missing persons database used by law enforcement, they contacted the officials to re-add her name into the database. 5 weeks later, the Campilias were informed by Solano County detectives that they had a match. Holly Ann was their Dixon Jane Doe. This was heartbreaking news for Holly's family. In an interview, her mother, Sally, sadly said, "I just kept hoping she would show up one day with grandchildren, but with each year, I'd lose a little hope." Even though Holly Ann could now be laid to rest properly, neither her family nor the police knew what had happened to her. The investigation was abandoned until 2021, when Holly Ann's relatives contacted the police to inquire about the possibility of using modern forensic methods to identify Holly Ann's killer. Investigators got to work, and a male's DNA was found after evidence samples at the crime scene were sent for testing. In 2023, investigators from the Solano County Sheriff's Office declared that they think the DNA belongs to Herman Lee Hobbs, who is currently 76 years old and serving a sentence at a prison in Cilia. According to research, Herman Lee Hobbs had been a violent criminal throughout his adult life. In 1969, when he was 22 years old, he was accused of carrying out more than a dozen armed robberies across the Sacramento region. Hobbs admitted to being the serial robber and consented to plead guilty after leading police on a wild car chase. However, when it was time for his sentence, the 6'5" mechanic attempted to flee the courthouse and had to be tackled and subdued by a CHP officer. Herman Lee Hobbs's time behind bars for armed robbery was brief. He was back on the streets by 1975. He relocated to Rio Linda, a street away from Terry Pata, a 13-year-old junior high school student. One day in January 1975, Terry Pata was sent home from school early due to her having nausea and a headache. She, however, never made it home. 9 days later, her body was discovered nearby, placed inside a drain pipe. She had been raped and fatally stabbed. At the time, no suspect was ever found. Years of sexual assault by Herman Lee Hobbs weren't made public until 2000. He was convicted of raping a 15-year-old girl in Yuba County that year. When Hobbs was taken into prison, his niece and daughter came forward to express concerns that he might be responsible for the deaths of numerous children. This tip led investigators to Terry Pata's long-suppressed murder. When DNA from Terry Pata's crime scene was examined, it matched Hobbs. Hobbs, who was already serving a lengthy jail sentence for rape, pled not guilty to Terry Pata's murder and was given a further 25 years to life sentence. This was just the start. That same year, some loggers discovered a woman's skull in the Yuba County foothills. Through DNA testing, the remains were identified as 29 years old Brenda Ann Tucker, who vanished from her house in the area of Oroville in 1994. Hobbs was known to Brenda Tucker's loved ones. In the 1990s, he had occasionally even stayed at their home. Hobbs was accused of killing Tucker, but a court eventually dropped the charges in 2002 owing to a lack of proof. In 2023, after his DNA was a match to the DNA at Holly Ann Campilia's crime scene, Solano County investigators had Hobbs moved to the Justice Center detention facility in Fairfield. He is being charged with first-degree murder. According to the Solano County Sheriff's Office, investigators are collaborating with other organizations in Northern California to find any additional potential victims of Herman Lee Hobbs.
On September 28, 1979, 3 visitors who were out day tripping in Sugar Pine Point State Park called a local news reporter to report finding a body at a picnic area on Lake Tahoe's western coast in California. When the cops showed up, they discovered a terrifying situation. There laid a woman who had been battered and strangled to death. A lost shoe and numerous indications of prior battles suggested the woman had been pursued across the campground before her assailant caught up with her. Detectives assumed that she was most likely a solo traveler because there was no indication of her car or of any other possessions that would have served as identification. Despite the collection of forensic evidence, including a sexual assault kit from the crime scene. The case gradually became cold since neither the murder victim nor her possible killer could be identified. The young woman was reluctantly buried by the authorities in a simple grave with the sign, "Unidentified Female." Many years later in 2015, the El Dorado County Cold Case Homicide Unit made the decision to re-examine the long-dead Jane Doe and provided local Jewish newspapers with images of a particular religious jewelry she had been wearing when she was discovered. This appeared to have been a great move because the daughter of the victim reached out to the police after she recognized the jewelry. A DNA test was conducted, and the victim was identified as Patricia Carnahan through a DNA match to her now 61-year-old daughter. Patricia Carnahan was 35 years old when she vanished while traveling throughout California in a red Volkswagen minibus in September 1979. Earlier that month, she had let her family know she was returning home, but after a month of not returning, Patricia's family in Virginia had reported her missing. Even though her Volkswagen was later found abandoned at a car dealership in Venice, California at the time, there were still no leads as to Patricia Carnahan's whereabouts. After her identity has been verified, authorities returned Patricia Carnahan's body to her family for a proper burial. Investigators were now left with catching Patricia's killer. After investigators tested the DNA on a discarded beer bottle that was discovered near where Patricia Carnahan was found, it matched the male DNA found on her body during autopsy. The three men who reported finding a body in 1979 were then tested for a DNA match, but they were immediately excluded as their DNA didn't match the one at the crime scene. Investigators uploaded the DNA profile of the suspect into CODIS, but there was no match at the time. In 2022, in order to deal with the state's backlog of testing rape kits, the Washington State Attorney General's office launched the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Project. Since 1981, the Spokane Police Department has maintained over 1,500 untested kits on hand, some of which were used in a rape investigation involving a man named Harold Carpenter in 1994. A homeless Spokane lady alleged that Harold Carpenter had physically and sexually abused her in April 1994. At the time, Carpenter was arrested and placed into the Spokane County Jail on a charge of second-degree rape. The case was, however, suspended after it was determined to be unprovable, and no official charges were ever filed. The rape kit was nevertheless saved as evidence. After the rape victim's kit was turned in for DNA testing in August 2022, a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab notified Spokane Police Department detectives in early February 2023 that the DNA from the 1994 rape kit is connected not only to the DNA in CODIS, but also to the 1979 murder of Patricia Carnahan in El Dorado County, which was a cold case at the time. Based on this evidence, in 2023, investigators from El Dorado County arrived in Spokane to help the Spokane Police Department arrest Harold Carpenter. After his arrest, investigators soon learned that Carpenter had been involved in a handful of misdemeanors over the years, ranging from burglary, sexual assaults, disturbing the peace, possession of drugs, reckless driving, driving under the influence, among many others. However, he was never suspected of killing Patricia Carnahan. He either got away with his crimes or served a minimum time behind bars. Carpenter made his first court appearance in Spokane in March 2023. He remains jailed in lieu of $1 million bail.
In the early hours of January 3, 1991, when the Seaside police arrived at Sabato Park, they discovered the body of Vicky Johnson, a 34-year-old mother of three, lying on the sand on the playground. The police couldn't believe the sight before them. Vicky had suffered a very horrible death right in the park. She'd been strangled and suffocated. Her upper torso, which held part of her clothing, was set on fire, and she had a significant amount of sand lodged down her throat, as if her head had been held in the sand. Vicky also had bite marks from the attacker all over her body, and her clothes were torn. Her murder was so brutal that it left the community of Seaside in shock for many years. Due to the crack epidemic and the high crime rate at the time, Seaside was known as a violent community. That reputation was only strengthened by Vicky Johnson's brutal murder. Her case remained cold for almost 4 decades after investigators exhausted all possible leads. In 2021, Vicky's case was reopened by the Monterey County District Attorney's Office when the Cold Case Task Force was launched. After providing additional evidence to the California Department of Justice for DNA testing, investigators were able to identify a suspect in connection with the murder after 2 years of thorough testing. Thanks to the DNA sample taken from Vicky's fingernails, authorities were able to identify her killer as Frank Louis McClure, after entering the DNA into CODIS. Apparently, McClure left significant DNA underneath Vicky's fingernails while she struggled and fought vigorously for her life. Frank Louis McClure, who had lived all his life in Seaside, had a long list of crimes in his history book. His criminal history dates back to 1990 and includes assault, causing serious bodily harm, and resisting law enforcement. McClure broke the terms of his probation in 1994 by engaging in domestic violence and an assault with a deadly weapon. He received a 4-year prison term afterwards. From 1991 to 2011, Frank Louis McClure committed numerous crimes involving domestic violence and assault. He received little time in prison and was, however, never charged for murder. It is unknown whether McClure and Vicky were romantically involved. The motive of her murder is still unknown and probably will remain a mystery, since Frank Louis McClure died at the age of 77 in 2021 in his Seaside home. Regardless, Vicky Johnson's family is grateful that the murder has been solved.